All right.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm not sure which one it is. And yeah, late afternoon. And happy belated Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. So, yes, I'm Robert Buxton. Always a pleasure to be here. Last time we were in another room, which was also very nice, but the piano has come back from the doctor. And yeah, so that's good that the piano's health is doing well. I do this thing, so when I'm driving, I try to listen to music that I don't know much or anything about. Mostly classical composers that I don't know well, or I've heard their names, I've never listened to their music. And I was listening to Florent Schmitt, which is an interesting name because he's French, but the first name is French and the last name sounds German kind of, but nevertheless, he's an amazing composer. I would describe him as sounding a bit like a mix of Debussy and some Wagner, a little heavier Debussy. But that's an overgeneralization maybe. But I thought I would try to improvise in that style if I can to start. Maybe if I was thinking to do like Mary Had a Little Lamb in the style of Florent. What do you think? Is that okay? Yeah, so let's see. Maybe he would have called it, Marie a le petit. What's the word for lamb? Like agneau or something? I don't even know. I forgot. Anyway, here it is. I just made it a little more French. You have to add these chords, like, or those things. A little bit of murkiness, like the weather outside. You notice you go to France, Paris, and it's always a little bit gray, but it's part of the charm. Like today, this is like an August day in Paris, but it's still amazing because it's Paris. And then, with Florent Schmitt, I noticed he really likes this thing called tremolo, which is like, he just does that all the time. So anyway, now for some actual music that I'm going to play. That was just, some silly thing. I'll start with a few pieces I've done for you before. We meet every month. I'm too slow a learner to do a whole different program. But I do have later a couple new things. One is of work in progress. I'm doing the Rachmaninoff Paganini Rhapsody, but I'm trying to make it for one piano. And this is a little bit crazy. It's difficult to do, and it's slow learning, but we'll talk about that when I get there. I've played you the 18th variation, and I'll maybe play it again, but from the beginning I have not played it for you yet. But to start, I'm going to do Ave Maria by Schubert, which I've played for you. This is an arrangement by Liszt for solo piano because I absolutely cannot sing, except for the first words, Ave Maria. The text that Schubert used was different than the Latin that we normally hear today. You usually will hear that Hail Mary prayer in Latin sung to this music, but Schubert used a German text, a translation of part of Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake, which is a King Arthur era legend sort of thing. And so it's a very different text, different effect when you hear it that way. And this is one of Schubert's Lieder, Lieder, songs for voice and piano. And that's, in a way, was the main thing he wrote. He wrote an enormous amount of Lieder, even multiple Lieder in a single day in his final few years. And that's when he wrote this in that period in 1825. 3 years later, he died at 31, which is just unbelievable. He was quite ill, and he knew his time was limited. And I read this thing about him, I don't know if it's true, because sometimes you don't know if it's what you're reading is AI or not, but it's an interesting idea to think about. I read that Schubert, generally, he was partly homeless in his later years, and he would stay with his friends, sleep on their couches. And he would fall asleep with his glasses on, wake up with his glasses on. Why? Because he would compose literally until the moment he fell asleep, and then from the moment he woke up. That's how desperate he was to write as much as he could. And when he died, he was not only penniless, he played piano in bars just to have enough to eat something in his later years. He was unknown completely except for this group of devoted friends that he had in Vienna. You may have heard of the Schubertiade evenings, which were informal concerts at people's homes. Maybe they resembled this a little bit. It wasn't the giant concert hall thing, which sometimes I think can be overrated, but that's a different story. But Schubert, he was pretty much unknown. And after he died, many people started to discover his music. In particular, Liszt. Liszt was just mesmerized especially by the Lieder. And Liszt started doing his own arrangements of Schubert's Lieder and performing them at his early concerts. And that's part of what made Liszt such a sensation. Some of it was that he modeled himself on Paganini, on being this fire-breathing virtuoso. Yes, but there was also the melodic side to him. And this just hypnotized people in his concerts. That Liszt would always play, for example, I played it for you before, the Stanchion in his arrangement. You've heard of Listomania. That was maybe part of the reason you had that. So here's Ave Maria through Liszt's interpretation. And what Liszt does is, towards the middle and the end, he adds a lot of Liszt to it. Because he's a shrewd arranger, a great arranger, genius arranger, and knows that if he just simply copied what the original does, it wouldn't make sense as a solo piano piece. So in the beginning, it's Schubert pretty much. The music as a solo work. And that's obviously Liszt added all those extra notes there. So, and that's also something Liszt just couldn't help himself from doing, I think, adding those extra notes. But it's not that he was just showing off. Some people believe, Liszt would just add arpeggios. No. There's a brilliant reason why he does that. It makes it speak as a solo piano piece. Here it is. Ave Maria, Schubert, Liszt. that's Liszt's interpretation of Schubert, how he does an arrangement. I love his arrangements of anything. I'm learning more of Schumann, of other Schubert songs too. So here's an original piece by Liszt, the Consolation number 3 in D flat, which you've heard me play. I played it for you before too. This is something Liszt wrote after Chopin died, 1849. That was the year Chopin died. You know, the thing about their friendship is, I describe it like this, that Liszt considered Chopin to be his friend, and I don't think Chopin considered Liszt to be his friend. And this, unfortunately, as much as I love Chopin, I don't think it reflects too well on Chopin. I've read some of his letters. I couldn't keep reading them because the level of caustic, you know, he was actually, I hate to say this, Chopin could be very anti-Semitic too, and just, there's all these things in the, and he felt, you know, about Liszt, he looked down at Liszt. He thought Liszt was a showman, just like a circus performer. And he called him out on that, actually. There was a concert where Liszt was playing, I think it was some of the etudes by Chopin, and Chopin just ran up to him, I think in the concert, and chewed him out. He said, "What are you doing to my music? You're ruining it. You know, play what I wrote, for goodness sake." You know, but Liszt adored Chopin so much, he even wrote a book about Chopin. It's not a historical biography, but I cannot recommend it enough because it's just this loving tribute, not only to Chopin himself, but to the world, Poland, and the culture that Chopin came from. It really, when I read it, it helped me visualize Chopin's music in a whole different way, you know, the mazurkas and everything. But, you know, I think also Liszt too was from Eastern Europe. He's from what's now Hungary, although it was Austro-Hungary, and he never learned Hungarian. He only spoke German, and, well, he spoke French and everything else, but not Hungarian. But I think Liszt identified with Chopin as well. They were both exiles from their homelands, living in Paris. Not a bad place to be, but it's, you know, that's not where they were from. So, in this piece, it sounds like Chopin. It really sounds, at least in the first page, it sounds like a piece by Chopin. So. It has this Chopin-esque feeling to it, but I think imitation is one way composers learn. You know, I personally like to do these very silly kind of imitations. Mary Had a Little Lamb in the style of who knows who, but who knows what. But I think Liszt starts the piece like Chopin, and then like the last one, he sort of ends up sounding like himself, of course. And you know, finally, 1849, 1 year before that. Think back to your European history. 1848 was one of the most bloody years in European history. There were revolutions being fought on the street. It was a very horrible year. Someone said like 1968 in this country, something like that. And so there's a feeling of maybe disillusionment in this piece, of sadness. There's something very heavy. And like I said, I think I said consolation is like the word to console. So he takes that phrase from some poetry by Paul Verlaine. And Liszt, by the way, he was a very well-read person. He did not really go to school, as I understand, as a young man, but in Paris, this was his story. It's a little bit like if you've ever seen the Rocky Balboa movies. I'm from New Jersey, so you know. But Liszt sort of was, as a young man, he was actually quite depressed. He had fallen in love with this nobleman's daughter or something. It didn't work. And he was just, I think he tried to jump in the sand at one point. He was just miserable. And then he heard Paganini. And then he, like Rocky, you know, he threw himself into practicing and not only practicing, there's this wonderful story of like self-improvement. That's what Liszt is all about. And also bettering himself at just reading as much as he could and learn. And he actually read while he practiced. Was reading about, when he would practice exercises, and things just like scales and things, he would read Dante, Shakespeare, everything, Verlaine, and that's a good way. So, you know, personally, I've tried it a little bit, and it's only certain things you can read with. Like if you're practicing other things, it's a really horrible idea. But if you're just doing arpeggios or something, and it's boring, so you just read a little something, right? But anyway, this is Liszt Consolation number 3, based on Paul Verlaine, in memory of Chopin. Liszt is calling, right? Yeah. So that's not extroverted showy music at all. And I think even like the end, it's this beautiful effect. It's like sunlight reflecting on water or something. Maybe that's where Debussy sort of started from, where Liszt ended off. So Liszt is one. By the way, also about timing. Sometimes I always got this criticism, and it's kind of true. I would have teachers always tell me, you just can't keep a tempo. Yeah, it's kind of true. I don't really keep a tempo. But here's the thing that Liszt said about tempo. He said, tempo is more like sailing than rowing. I love that, because rowing means, boom, boom. But sailing is feeling the big picture, right? So there's my excuse. No, but it depends on the music. Sometimes, like maybe a very scintillating passage of Mozart, you want to have that like crispness of time. But I think in that piece, everything has to be more not mushy, but whatever. There's a good word for mushy. Next, I'm going to play another, well, rather sad piece. I'm sorry, I always have this pattern. I start by depressing everybody, and then I try to bring it up again. So get the sad things out of the way first. But in all seriousness, this is the Abendlied, or Evening Song, by Schumann, written in his later years. And I have a new story about this, something that happened to me with this piece. But this is just complete, it's even more quiet and peaceful than the last piece, than the list. It's just almost empty in a way. And this is something he wrote shortly before he tried to take his life. He had bipolar disorder, or what they think was bipolar, suffered from this, severe mental illness throughout his life. And, but by the end he was hearing voices. He was really quite in bad shape. And that's around the time he wrote this piece. And I was thinking, I would imagine he would have written something more disturbing sounding than this. This is not disturbing, at least initially. And I played this somewhere a week ago, and a lady came to me and she said, I found that piece incredibly disturbing, to the point I didn't even like it. And I said, how so? And she said, well, under the surface, something is just incredibly unsettling about this piece. And I hadn't noticed that until she said it. That's why I love people's comments, because I want to hear what you hear, and trust yourself with what you hear, because you might be onto something even more sometimes than the textbook might let on. So I mean it. That's your individual, listening reaction. So I hear it now in this piece. Abendlied, Evening Song. This is from a set called Music for Children, Young and Old. And one reason Schumann wrote a lot of childhood-themed music later in life was he had many children with Clara, and he was a very involved father. But also, I think that in the 19th century and late 18th century, in philosophy and thought, there was this ideal of the naivete of childhood. And Rousseau exemplifies this in Emile. It's a book about childhood. And before that, people didn't value childhood. They looked at children as little adults who were just there to milk the cows, But the idea that childhood has this sort of magical side to it, which we hold on to this today. Look how many movies are about, what am I trying to say? Glorifying childhood. I don't think there's any reason to glorify it either. I don't miss it, but this piece has that, I call it the glow of childhood, this innocence to it. And that's this piece. But of course there's also that sadness. And when I play it, I also feel like he's saying goodbye in some way. And maybe he was, because he didn't live very long after this. And he definitely didn't write anything much after this. Thanks. And maybe what it is with Schumann is that I had a teacher who said this, that he always sees Van Gogh's paintings in Schumann like the starry night, the swirling sky. Even in that piece, there's always something like that. And there's another artist who suffered from mental illness. And maybe that's what's disturbing about it. But that's Schumann. It's so beautiful, but it's also a little bit unhealthy in a way. So we won't dwell too much in Schumann. Let's go to Debussy, arranged by Ericourt. So we have, I don't mean to embarrass you, this is another one of Daniel Ericourt's incredible and incredibly tricky, scary to play arrangements. This is, Il pleure dans mon cœur. It rains in my heart. I think we've been getting some with we need it with this drought, but that's, sorry, I'm digressing. So, wait a minute. I made a mistake about something. Remember I was telling you about Liszt and Paul Verlaine? Wrong. Il pleure dans mon cœur is Paul Verlaine. Liszt, the poem of consolation, is from Lamartine. I'm so sorry, but I caught that, okay? So, Il pleure dans mon cœur, it rains in my heart, is a poem by Paul Verlaine. That's the text, and of course, thank goodness I'm not singing it. And Daniel Ericourt, and of course Jane is right here. Daniel Ericourt arranged this for solo piano, and it's just like when Liszt arranges, Schubert. When a master arranges a master, you get both composers, and so there's a lot of Ericourt in here. And boy, is it tricky. This is one of the most tricky things, but it's wonderful. I mean, I can play this vocal piece on the piano and pretend to be a singer. So what does he do? This is Impressionism. What is Impressionism? I think it's when a painting or a piece of music gives you a foggy impression of something. That's a big generalization, because look, it rains in my heart, so the rain don't you imagine the rain? It's not only that it sounds like rain, it even smells like rain, I think. You know how rain has that sort of, in a good way, I mean, not acid rain or something, but it has that feeling to it. So here is the piece, and I'll do my best. I don't know what it is, tricky stuff. Daniel really wrote tricky music, and that's good. I mean, why should he have written something that was just easy? But it's a challenge to play. So. Thank you, and thank you to Daniel that he did that, because there's no other solo piano arrangement of Debussy songs that I know of. I'm going to play now some of Rachmaninoff's Paganini Rhapsody from 1935. This is for piano and orchestra. So I can't, travel around with an orchestra, unfortunately, and even if I could, I don't think they would all fit there. So what I'm trying to do is smush everything, that's the technical term, smush everything into one piano. It's a little bit crazy as an idea, but I'm going to do my best. So I'm going to play variations 1 until I really feel I ought to stop. It's still very much a work in progress, as I said, but I just wanted to share it with you. And I'll be playing this again, and I'll be adding, variations here and there every month. So this is something Rachmaninoff wrote later in life. If you've heard the Second Concerto and all these amazing and famous things he wrote, like that's the Second Concerto. Early Rachmaninoff. That's when he was, he obviously had his own style, but he was in Russia, had been a sort of protege of Tchaikovsky. And then he and his family left in 1917 when the Communist Revolution happened. He didn't see any future for himself or his family. Lived in Western Europe for a while, and he ended up living in the US. Someone said he was a triple emigre, because first he lived in Dresden, I think, and then he lived in New York, and then he lived in Beverly Hills, California. And he loved it there. I don't really know why. Nothing wrong with California, but it's just a contrast, this 19th century Russian man, and there's pictures of him with palm trees. He was happy there. But Rachmaninoff, in his early music, sounds quite different than in his late music, because when he came to the West, he actually didn't write a whole lot for a while. I think in the 1920s, he did a couple arrangements and revised the Fourth Concerto. I don't think he really wrote much music at all, because he was depressed. He struggled with depression at different points in his life, but he was so homesick that he just couldn't do it. But in the 30s, this miracle happened. His creativity just came back, and the music he wrote changed. It was different, of course. And when I play this piece, and this is something I was talking to my friend who said, the Paganini Rhapsody, I don't relate to it quite as much as, say, the Third Concerto. And as I'm playing this piece, I realize what it is. It's Rachmaninoff, think of a 19th century Russian man in the Manhattan of the 1930s. Yeah, that's what this piece is, maybe. It's two worlds clashing. And Rachmaninoff gets this criticism. People say he was a throwback to the 19th century. He was not sufficiently modernistic enough, whatever that means. Because, you know what, this piece, let me play you the beginning. If this is not 20th century sounding, I don't know what is. And then Paganini comes in, right? But it's a different Rachmaninoff. And there's a darkness to even a menacing quality, like here. This is really menacing. That's really good. Speaking of menacing, there's like these, it sounds like it could be from a Batman movie or something. I don't know when the last time I saw one was, probably 25 years ago, but there's this obsession he had, the Dies Irae, which is a chant from the Middle Ages, the Day of Wrath, and that is a scary thing. That is. And he combines it with like Russian bells. It's like. Hear the Dies Irae. If I wanted to do late Rachmaninoff, Happy Birthday to You, I would just do. You just have to throw in the Dies Irae. No, I'm joking, that's an oversimplification, but that's part of the late style. It's just different. It's a different Rachmaninoff. And so I'm going to play you, yeah, some of it. Amazing piece, amazingly sort of impossible to try to do all the parts. So it's work in progress. Here's some of the Rachmaninoff Paganini. hate to do it this way in segments, but it's taking a long time. And even that, it needs some sanding and some polishing, but it'll get there. It's just crazy doing all the parts. I'm trying to smush it together. I feel obligated, why not, to play the 18th variation, which I always play for you. And that's where he takes and turns it upside down. And this is maybe where it's even more striking, I think, to hear it in the context of the rest of the piece, because this is where he reaches back to his older style, pre-revolution. He goes back there as if in a dream, I think. That's this piece. It's so nostalgic. I mean, I think all his music is nostalgic, but there's a sort of hard realism to a lot of what you just heard. But I think this is just so heartfelt, and it's even cinematic. A lot of movies use it. He joked about that. He said when he finished it, he said, boy, the publishers are going to like this one. So, yeah. So that I played longer, so it sounds a little more marinated than the rest of it. That's just it. So I've been playing that since the summer. I learned it first, then I learned the Ludoslavsky Paganini, and then I learned what you just heard like not that long ago. So now, speaking of new things, I'm going to play you two versions of Flight of the Bumblebee, Rachmaninoff's and then Georgy Chifra's. I told you last time I played you Rachmaninoff's. Why did I learn this piece? Well, I was walking outside the other day and several bumblebees were flying around in my face. And I thought of this music and realized I'd never learned it. So I learned it in honor of all those flying things that, well, we need them for the flowers and the honey and everything. But, this is such an evocative piece. When I practice it, my wife starts to tell me, she's like itching all over when you play it. Because, sounds like a darn bumblebee. Yeah. Now, and to begin, just, yeah. It's from the opera, The Tale of the Tsar Sultan by Rimsky-Korsakov, 1900, that's 1901, I think. And in the beginning of Act 2, there's this prince who turns into a bumblebee so that he can fly into the royal palace and see the Tsar, who happens to be his dad. It's a, it's a Russian fairy tale. They're weird. That's all I could say. So here's Rachmaninoff's version, and it's still a little raw for me, so, sometimes the bumblebee crashes into a wall, but, I'm working on it. Schiffer's version. This is the newest thing for me. And it's very hard, because what Schiffer does, instead of writing single notes, he makes it into octaves. The whole thing. Now, it sounds like a swarm of hornets rather than a bumblebee. I honestly think nobody can play it except Schiffer. So I'm not even trying. I'm just curious to play it because it's a different version, and I like having different versions of the same thing. This is the type of arrangement that takes a lot of liberty, adding new sections and ideas even. And Schiffer was an amazing person and pianist. He was born in Hungary, and he was a prisoner of war for a long time. I think the Nazis forced him to fight on their side, not that he had any choice or wanted to. The Soviets imprisoned him. I think they kept him, and he did hard labor for many years, lifting these stones to the point that he damaged his ligaments and muscles in his arms. Can you believe that for a pianist? And he would wear these, you can see in videos of him, he wears these big leather bracelets to support, they're just like straps supporting his ligaments. But he had the most incredible technique. But you know what? Technique is not about speed. That's the thing. He has that, and fire. He was gypsy. He just breathed fire when he played. But every phrase he played was musical, even the fastest thing. That's what's so remarkable about him. It wasn't just, oh, hey, he can play fast and not. When he's doing it, it's just, there's a musicality to it that's breathtaking. He's one of my heroes, and I would never even dream of reaching, to his feet. But I wanted to learn this piece. This is his arrangement. It's absolutely wild. I'm really not there yet, but I'm going to work towards it. It's really something. So this is Schiffer's Flight of the Bumblebee. For a minute, that's one more minute-long piece. Not the minute waltz. This is a gospel tune, a spiritual, old-time religion. So I love how people add some lyrics to it comically. Sometimes I've heard someone singing, "If it was good enough for Aphrodite, it's good enough for me." Because, well, old-time religion, right? It's old-time religion. Here it is. In a month. Yeah. Maybe it'll be warmer. I'd be careful what you wish for. Right? That is true. Yeah. But thank you for having me. Is today
second Monday of every month.
Today's a Monday. You know, it doesn't feel like a Monday, does it? It feels like a Tuesday. It has that flavor. Yeah. And that's the key. You know, so if someone asks me how do you memorize music, I don't remember anything else. So I don't. What's the day? What month are we? What is it? April? Yeah, it doesn't matter. Okay, but I think it's a Monday over here. I wrote it down. So second or third Monday. Let me check and tell you officially. I'm sorry. I'm confusing myself. So okay.